What would you do if you found out the most delicious soup in the village came from a pot with a dark secret? Let's find out.
There was an old woman who sold the best palm oil soup in the market. Nobody knew her name or where she lived. Nobody knew how she made such excellent soup or why the soup was always so hot. This is a mystery, the people at the market would say to each other. But they continued to buy the soup. Every morning, the old woman came into the market in the village of Obodo, carrying a big black pot of hot palm oil soup on her head. She would sit under a tall udara tree, and soon all her soup would be sold because it was so good. There was a boy in the village named Ifeanyi. He had often enjoyed the old woman's soup and wanted to know how it was made. He wanted to know where the old woman lived. And one evening when the market closed, Ifeanyi decided to follow the old woman. He followed her through the village and beside the river Anunu. Keeping himself out of sight, he followed her along a path that went up the side of a hill. Ifeanyi began to feel scared, but he kept going. He followed the old woman until she came to a small round hut with mud brick walls and a grass-thatched roof. Outside the hut stood a very large cooking pot. It is the biggest pot I have ever seen, thought Ifeanyi. The old woman went inside the hut. Ifeanyi was so curious that he went quietly to the pot and looked inside. It was empty. Hearing the old woman coming out of the hut, he quickly hid behind some thorn bushes. He watched the old woman come out of the hut. She went to the very large cooking pot and, raising her arms above her head, she whispered some strange words that Ifeanyi couldn't understand. The pot began to bubble and steam without any fire beneath it. The smell of the soup was so good that it made Ifeanyi feel hungry. When the old woman went back into her hut, Ifeanyi came softly from behind the thorn bushes. He looked under the pot. There was no fire beneath it. He looked into the pot. It was full of hot palm oil soup with chicken. I must taste this, said Ifeanyi to himself, putting his hand into the pot to select a piece of chicken. But suddenly the old woman came out of her hut. She saw Ifeanyi and what he was doing. "Oh, oh, oh," cried the old woman. "Oh, oh, oh." He turned and ran down the hillside path as fast as he could. Behind him, he could hear the old woman. She was screaming and wailing, shouting and crying. Ifeanyi ran and ran until he reached the bottom of the hill. He ran beside the river Anunu, past the market and into the village. He ran to his family's house. He told his parents and the people of the village what had happened. He pointed to the hill. As the people looked at the hill, they could see steam rising from it. The magic pot, everyone said to each other. That night, Ifeanyi couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the old woman and her pot. The next morning he went to the market, but the old woman was not there. Days passed, and still there was no sign of her. The villagers began to worry that something bad had happened to her. One evening, Ifeanyi's grandfather, who was a wise elder, told him a story about an old woman who once lived in the village long ago. She was said to have a pot that could cook without fire and make the best soup. One day, she disappeared and her pot was never found. The story sent chills down Ifeanyi's spine. Determined to uncover the truth, Ifeanyi gathered his friends Ada and Namdi, and they set off to the old woman's hut again. As they walked beside the river Anunu, the air grew colder and the sounds of the night seemed eerier. When they reached the hut, it looked abandoned. The large cooking pot stood outside, covered in dust. Ada noticed strange symbols carved into the hut's walls, symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Namdi found a hidden compartment near the pot, filled with old dried herbs and peculiar stones. The symbols on the stones matched the carvings on the walls. Suddenly, they heard a whisper behind them. They turned to see the old woman, her eyes glowing in the darkness. She smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "Welcome back," she said in a raspy voice. "I see you have found my secrets." The children were too scared to move. "The pot requires special herbs and rituals to stay hot without fire," she continued, "but it comes at a cost. Now that you know my secret, you must help me." Terrified, the children watched as the old woman started chanting. The pot began to bubble and steam again, and the ground beneath them trembled. The children realized that they had to escape. "Run!" Ifeanyi shouted. They sprinted down the hill as fast as they could, the old woman's laughter echoing behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the village. Out of breath, They told their parents and the village elders what had happened. The next day, the village elders decided to go up the hill to investigate. When they reached the hut, it was empty. The old woman and her pot had vanished without a trace. Only the strange symbols and dried herbs remained. From that day on, no one dared to go near the hill. The villagers would often see steam rising from it and hear whispers in the night. They believed the old woman and her enchanted pot were still out there, guarding her secret. When clouds gathered near the top of the hill, the village people would say to each other, "Look, there is the steam from the magic cooking pot." And so, the spooky legend of the old woman and her enchanted cooking pot lived on, reminding everyone in Obodo to respect the mysteries and the unknown powers that lurked in the most unexpected places.
And so, the mystery of the old woman's cooking pot teaches us that some secrets are better left alone. If you enjoyed this story and don't want the old woman chasing you down the hill, like, share, and subscribe for more tales.